Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with another episode, sort of, in the Electoral System series. So this one is going to be slightly different. We are not discussing a electoral system that is used or proposed. I've more or less done all the ones I was planning on doing because all the remaining ones, such as rural urban proportional, are really just taking existing systems that I've already covered and mixing and matching them in such a way that you create a different system. So in particular case of rural urban proportional, urban districts are STV, rural districts are mixed proportional. There we go. You glue those two systems together, and you get what do you get? Not that interesting. If someone wants to comment below if you have a particular system that I have not covered that you would like to see, and in that case I might cover it, though. If it is a system that isn't actually used or has not been proposed somewhere, probably not. But if you know of a system that's been proposed or been used that I have not covered, by all means, let me know in the comment below and I'll cover it. Other thing worth noting, I posted this on my Twitter at Bagel Polling early this week. I meant to have this video out on Tuesday, but because of delays, because I I did not realize how much the Quebec and U.S. forecasting projects are going to take out of my time. So that took a lot more time than I thought. So I'm way behind schedule on things like this. But it's worth noting, for those of you who see this, that Friday, May 24th? Yeah, Friday, May 24th, or June. It's June. Friday, June 24th at 8 Eastern Time, we will be doing a live stream. And it's not any in particular live stream, it's just going to be a general one. It's mostly going to be on Canadian things, so if you are not a Canadian viewer, I don't know. I mean, by all means, come and watch it, but that's the main topics that are going to be discussed. I hope to see you all there, but otherwise, let us get into electoral systems. Canada's elections improved. So where are we at first? So why do we have elections? So there's four main reasons. So we give citizens a choice on how they should be governed. Largely speaking, in settled democracies, basically, do you want red or blue? Or do you want... Actually, red and blue are the two main colors you use, so it's normally red or blue. Sometimes it's green, sometimes it's like gold, but it's mostly red or blue. Provide areas with a local spokesperson, i.e. a local MP. So, in the case of myself, there is an MP for Halifax West federally, and that MP is supposed to represent myself and my neighbors and other people in the district. And if we have issues or concerns in a working, functional system, we would talk to that person, and that person represent us to Parliament. The third action is to hold governments accountable. So if an MP, or in broader terms, an entire government is not acting the way to the will of the voters, or they're just woefully incompetent, people have the ability to vote for someone new and replace them. And the final one is to represent the citizenry. Now, this is slightly different than number two, because number two is specifically about a local person to speak about local issues to the broader society. 4 is about representing people ideologically. So, in other words, representation in this regard is, does the Parliament reflect the proportion of the population who are red, who are blue, who are green, who are gold, who are purple, who are black, or whatever? And I'm talking about party colors specifically. That's the general idea for 4th. That's the gist for 4th. So, what are the limitations we have here? Because the thing about it, if we're trying to make the system better, we have to think about what is limiting the system. We know what our goal is, and so we need to figure out what's stopping us from getting there. So, the first is it's impossible to have a perfect voting system. Now, again, I'll put it in the description. There is on what is the channel called? It was PBS Infinite Series. I think the channel's been they've been discontinued now, but presumably they're still up on YouTube. They did a great sub-series on elections and mathematically why it is actually impossible to have a perfect voting system. And when I say a perfect voting system, I mean a perfect way to count votes. There is no perfect way to count votes. There are pros and cons of every system, and that's basically the premise of this entire series. I'll relink that video in this description, so if you want to look in more on that, you can. The lamentation is elected officials don't really face much penalty for lying. It's a common trope that a politician will promise the moon during the election campaign and then not do any of that. And then the next election will be like, well, you're either going to vote for me or you're going to vote for the other guy, and the other guy's awful. That's the common trope. And really, there's not any way to penalize that in how Canada currently does its elections. Yes, in principle, we can vote for someone who doesn't do that, but if everyone's doing that, in the case of Canada, both red and blue are doing that, and you vote purple or orange or green or light blue or some other color, well, those parties are very unlikely to actually win a seat. So in a lot of ways, your vote, it does matter, but it's not as impactful as it could have been. For example, if you like blue a little more than you like red, it makes sometimes more sense to vote blue than it does to, say, vote light blue or purple or green or whatever. And obviously, that flips the other way around too. And the final one is excessively rigid party discipline. Now, this one is particularly insidious to how Canada's system is set up, because we are set up with, as we go back here for a moment, number 2, provide local spokesperson. That is the second largest reason, most important part of our system in theory. And how Canada's electoral government system has been structured, this is one of the most important parts. Excessive rigid party discipline completely undermines that, because effectively it means it is impossible for you to have a contrary opinion to your party leader as an MP. Backbenchers have no freedom. And this isn't just on big ticket bills like confidence motions and major items of the platform. This is across the board. There's no dissent allowed in parties. You see this with, for example, the Liberal Party's very renowned for their party discipline. It's almost impossible to find a Liberal MP who's willing to publicly speak out if they disagree about anything. Same thing with NDP, same thing with Bloc. The Conservatives are not quite as strict on this, but they're still very strict on it. And if it wasn't for the fact that total party discipline would annihilate the party, the Conservatives would 100% have as much party discipline as the Liberals. The only reason they have less party discipline is because the party physically could not exist if they whipped every single vote. It would immediately disintegrate. But with that, they whip as hard as they can without breaking the party. All the parties do this. They're all equally guilty, some more guilty than others perhaps, but they're all terrible for it. And it has undermined the purpose of local MPs, to the point that a lot of people who advocate for proportional systems, I think perhaps rightly so, argue that the local representative doesn't actually represent anyone locally anymore in Canada because of how the system functions. And the other really insidious part here, I have not noted this down, but it is worth noting. I guess it's partially with point 3 here, but it's not entirely. In a lot of cases, the local representative for riding is just airdropped in by party HQ, and in a lot of cases, it's not even voted on by members of that party. I know myself in particular, my local riding, the local Conservative candidate was not picked by the local Conservative Party members, the local EDA council. They were just nominated. Now, I have no problem with the 2021 candidate. I think she was perfectly acceptable person. But the local EDA had no choice involved. And presumably, every other party is very similar. I've not seen any inkling that any other party does allow uniformly their local EDAs to pick candidates. Sometimes it does happen, but overwhelmingly, a huge percentage of MPs every single election are airdropped in by party HQ, and they are not picked by either the people from the community or even the subsample of the community that is party members. Neither of those two things are true. So, this is what's killing the system. This is what's hurting our system. Now, point one, we can't really fix, but we can sort of affect point 2, 3, and this fourth point that I didn't write down here. So what can we do? Well, one solution, as I alluded to, is a lot of people suggest we reform to a proportional system. So this makes 4.4 better from the first slide. That is, it improves representation. That is true. Proportional systems do objectively make it better representation. In other words, quote-unquote vote inefficiencies are lower, and people's choices in parties are less negatively impacted. Now, personally, I don't actually think that is that useful, because in practice, even in proportional systems, it's still a two-party system. It's just, effectively, you have two parties that coalitions can build around. It's very rare that you have three parties that can make a coalition. It's almost always party A or party B, often blue or red. And there's some smaller parties that might side red or might side blue, but not always. Example, the Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, all kind of function like that. In these places, they don't... the proportional system does improve representation, but it doesn't really meaningfully impact how government functions at all. In a lot of ways, it can actually reduce the ability to hold people accountable, though that's more of an abstract thing. But what it is objectively is if you go to a full party list proportional, well, you just completely destroyed the entire concept of local spokesperson. They don't exist anymore. And even something as small as, or as middle ground as mixed member proportional still no longer has the same weight to it. I believe Germany, a quarter, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone who's more familiar with the German system, I don't have it in front of me to look at it right now as I say this, but I believe about a quarter of their MPs typically are party list MPs to balance out parliament. So a quarter of their MPs have nothing to do with local spokespersoning. So then the ones who do are kind of diluted in their impact. So it does undermine it a bit, though it still exists in that system. Something like STV, which is not really a proportional system, I guess it's more proportional in practice, but that's another whole other question. That still maintains local representative, but then it gets a bit more complicated, because if you have 5 people from your district, who's actually representing the district? It's a bit more muddied. That's not necessarily to say it doesn't have them, it just isn't as clear-cut, perhaps. So what am I proposing? So my proposal here is threefold. So first, we have open primaries for each seat. In other words, we would have a law in the books that a certain number of days before an election, let's say 6 months, all the parties will have a primary at the exact same time, run by Elections Canada, and every eligible voter will be sent a voter information card, and they can vote in the primaries. But the catch is they can only vote at one party's primary. So if you want to go and vote in the Conservative primary, go ahead. Anyone can do that. But then you cannot vote in the Liberal primary the NDP primary, the People's Party primary, the Green primary, whatever other parties exist in your local area, you can only vote in one of them. The idea behind this is it actually helps the local representative actually be a local representative. They are selected by the community to represent that community. There would be no limit on who could be in any of the party's primaries. So, well, I'll rephrase this. Anyone who is a member of that party can be in that party's primary, and the parties could I don't want to hash out an entire piece of legislation here, but the parties could hash out exactly what they mean by good standing. But anyone with good standing in the party can stand in the primary. And then the voters, even voters who are not part of that party, would select which of these people in the party they like the best. Now, to combine with that, we would allow recall petitions. Now, a recall petition, in practice, I don't have an exact number I want to set it at. I want to do a lot more research and probably a lot of studies before I picked a solid number. But there'd be some percentage of electors in a riding who, after signing a petition, if they all agreed that they don't like the current person, their current local representative, then there would be a recall election, and the recalled MP would stand up for re-election in this recall. If they lose, then it would be one of the people. So you'd have two categories of people. You'd have the person being recalled, and the first question is, should they be recalled? Should they stay on as MP? If they get recalled, then you have a second ballot, which is of all of these other people who are running. In Canada, they should probably limit it to one per party and link it back out at the open primaries above. Then you would have which of these people should replace them. Maybe two questions on the ballot. That's the whole ballot. This would allow the ability for local districts to recall an MP they think is doing a bad job, they don't think is representing them, or perhaps particularly scandal-plagued person could be withdrawn. And it gives people more control over their representatives. And finally, this is an important one. The other two in Canada, we could do just whenever. That would just be legislative changes. There's no reason why constitutionally that would be a problem. Open primaries would be a bit funky with confidence motions. But, well, we could probably put an exception that in case of a confidence vote, you could helicopter candidates down. But any fixed term election, that would be fine. Ideally, we would amend the Constitution to remove confidence votes, but that would be in line with this one. So, split the executive from the legislative elections. If this does occur, I would remove confidence votes at all. Confidence votes and the Westminster political system or parliamentary system, I think, are both abjectly terrible government systems. Why most of the countries in the world use them, I don't know. They are awful. They're really bad for the voters, and they give a lot of power to the central government. Long story short, in a Westminster Parliament, there is no such thing as a distinction between the executive and the legislator. There is no difference. They are the same thing. The executive legislates and executes, completely violating the principle of separation of powers, completely and utterly. And in the case of places like Canada, our Prime Minister is effectively one of the most powerful executives in the world, on par with some dictators. Because they can unilaterally legislate effectively whatever they want, because to be Prime Minister, you have to have a majority in the House. So, by definition, you have control of the legislature if you're the Prime Minister. So, by definition, the Prime Minister, who runs the executive, can get any bill they want passed. And to add to that, over long enough periods of time, the party in power nominates all of the judges. So if one party controls the government for a very long period of time, all of the judges will be appointed by them. So they basically also control the judicial system. Because anyone who sits down and yells at me, it's like, but the judges are supposed to be independent. Screw off. Judges are humans. Humans are political. Judges are therefore political. At me in the comments if you don't agree with me there. Some judges might be noble and think more than just their base ideological concerns, but we cannot... Any system that is predicated on people being noble is doomed to fail. You have to assume that people are going to exploit the system when you make your system, and as long as your system is very hard to exploit, then you are guaranteeing a more stable system, a more fair system. So then, where are we here? Well, if we split the executive from the legislature, what that allows is we can independently vote for the prime minister, and we can independently vote for your legislative MP. One of the big problems Canada has right now, ignoring everything else about the Westminster system, is you sit down and you might be like, Blue has a really good local candidate who I think is going to represent me really well and is really awesome and is just a swell guy, literally the best human being in the world, but the party leader for Blue is evil and he ate a baby on cable television. How could I possibly vote that way? Well, I don't really mind the leader of Red. I'd rather the leader of Red be the prime minister. And, well, because how the system works, the prime minister is more important, so I'm going to vote Red because I don't want the baby eater. Extreme example, but, well, that is effectively how a lot of votes go. You look at polling, almost universally, the two things people vote for are the prime minister or ideologically. Very few people vote for the local MP. Now, that is an argument a lot of people who support proportional systems make a point that local MPs don't matter. Personally, I see that as more as a system making them not matter. You look at places in the US, and you will find Senate races where senators of one party can win in states that are wildly for the other party. For example, in 2014, Doug Jones won in Alabama, who was a Democrat, because his opponent was a corrupt, terrible person. My understanding. That is pretty much unheard of, but it does, not unheard of. That would be impossible in Canada. That would never happen. You would never see a Liberal win Fort McMurray. Or any other rural area in Saskatchewan, Alberta. Except that one part of Saskatchewan that has a lot of natives in it. Northern Saskatchewan. I believe it's the natives that are a large percentage there. The natives are more of a swing demographic than the other parts. But ignoring that, this split decision allows someone to pick who they think is going to be best at running the executive and who is best at going to be represent them to the legislature. Yes, this could mean that our legislature and our executive are not aligned. And in fact, not a lot of things might happen when that happens. But personally, that shouldn't be a problem because in a lot of ways, legislatures actually legislate too much. A lot of problems are solved by slapping legislation down when it really should be because of the fact that this is a bit just simplify a bit. A lot of things that are legislated are things that should actually be handled by a change in bureaucratic administration, i.e. regulation. And a lot of the regulations are not regulations that require the parliament to vote for. They are regulations that are farmed out to administrative agencies. Now, you could argue that administrative agencies shouldn't exist, and I would probably agree with you, but as long as they do exist, in a lot of ways that is more important to handle. A lot of things that the legislature should be doing should probably be handled by them. Now, I will give you, if the the administrative agencies don't want to take those actions. Sometimes the legislature has to act, but in a lot of cases, well, the legislature does something that the administrative agency is already doing, so it just double hits it. And anyways, I think the problem, the potential of having a parliament that is split from, or a legislature split from the executive, shouldn't be a problem to anybody, because that's the point. That's precisely why you have a separate legislature. People might like the way Red runs the country, but not want Red's legislation. That is a valid choice. There shouldn't be any reason why that shouldn't be allowed. And the important thing with that, especially if you are a supporter of a smaller party like People's Party or Greens or the NDP, this would make it actually easier for your party to win seats in the House and win seats in the legislature. Because when you remove the huge, overwhelming importance of the executive from the ballot, and you're just voting for your local MP, well, the stakes are a lot lower. Not only are the stakes a lot lower, but there's more considerations abound. It's more about who represents you best, who you think has the best ideas for you. And if you combine this with open primaries and recall petitions, all of these together effectively force parties to weaken, completely weaken their party discipline. They unilaterally have to disarm their party discipline. Because if you, let's say downtown Toronto had University Rosedale, to name a routing, in their open primary for the Conservative Party, they pick someone that University Rosedale loves, and they elect that Conservative to office. But then party discipline prevents that Conservative from acting in the interests of University Rosedale, and University Rosedale's angry about this. Well, University Rosedale can now recall that MP and elect a Liberal this time, because the Liberal Party is going to act more like the way they want. Now, you might argue that this might hurt the parties, but it really doesn't, because you look at the U.S., the U.S. does this, and not every state, by all means, but a lot of states do have open primaries, and the candidates elected in the open primaries are not any discernibly closer together. It doesn't make everyone more centrist, because if you do the primaries on the same day, any competitive district, people are going to look like, oh, well, if I vote for the other guy's primary to get someone more like me, I won't be voting in my primary to get someone I like. And keep in mind, if we just simplify this down to liberals and conservatives, there's more than that, but let's just simplify it down. There are flavors of liberal, and there's flavors of conservative. If you are, let's say, a blue liberal, you might vote, if you decide to vote in the conservative primary to get a red Tory, well, you could get a progressive liberal in the liberal primary. So now, you can't really vote for the liberals now, because you don't really agree with the progressive liberal. You might end up voting for the red Tory in the conservative primary. So in a lot of ways, it doesn't actually make much sense to do that if in general terms you liked the party you're in. If you are normally a partisan liberal, it makes more sense to vote in the liberal primary regardless, because voting to get someone who is going to be quote-unquote worse for your opponent or quote-unquote more like you from your opponent is counterproductive. Because let's say you are a progressive liberal and you vote in the conservative primary to get a red Tory because they're more like you. Well, now the blue liberals are more likely to vote for the red Tory because they're more similar than your progressive liberal who's running the Liberal Party. So now the blue liberals defect and now you might lose. So that doesn't make any sense. You decide to vote for someone who's really not like you. What if they end up winning? You just allow them to help win. That doesn't make any sense either. And if they don't win, because let's say they never had a chance, let's say you decide in the conservative primary to vote for the social conservative candidate in University Rosedale. Well, the social conservative in University Rosedale is probably not going to win, but neither was the Conservative candidate, University Rosedale. Probably wasn't going to win. So it doesn't really do anything for you. So you've advocated your choice in your own primary to maybe screw with someone else in a different primary? Not very likely. Not very effective. And in places where it's so overwhelming in the other direction, for example, let's say Fort McMurray, where I believe the Conservatives won by plus 80, well, most of the voters there are already Conservatives, so whatever the Liberals or NDP do there doesn't really affect the Conservative Party. So it doesn't hurt them. They're not going to suddenly get a more liberal candidate. They're going to get as conservative a candidate as they were going to get before. And in a lot of ways, since it's now an open primary and not helicoptered in from above, the candidate might be even more conservative in something like Fort McMurray. Or in the case of University Rosedale, maybe it'll be even more progressive of a candidate if you are a progressive liberal. And that would be better for you. So in a lot of ways, this only makes it better for the local person, because it only makes it more likely to represent how they actually believe. Because right now, or in a proportional system, you're voting ideologically, sure. You're voting liberal, either way. That's good. But, the person you're voting for doesn't actually care at all about you. They only care about what the party line is. So, in the case of a party list, you have no one speaking for you in particular, your area. You only have people speaking for your party, which might be something, but not really. And in a current system, if you vote for a local representative who is a partisan member of a party, I mean, almost all of them are partisans, well, they're not representing you, they're representing the party because their vote doesn't allow them to be different. Now, try to simplify this a bit. I don't want to make this too complicated, but that is my general proposal. Now, where would I put this? So this is first past the post tier. First past the post with these reforms, I think would be like an A+ tier. It's not quite S. I don't want to put it in S because S to me is like a voting system that no one would disagree with. My changes would make 1, 2, and 3 better. And if we just back up here. So it would give citizens more of a choice because they have the ability to select their candidate the entire process. And there is a difference inter-party or intra-party wise between different wings in a party. So it gives you way more control over over who's going to be in government. It's going to give you much more, empower your local spokespersons much more to the point that they actually do something, hopefully, and they can represent you. Now, I will say, there are MPs currently in Canada who do represent their local constituents very well, but they're a minority. And this helps hold the government more accountable because it makes it more clear who's at fault. It's easier, if the Prime Minister is the problem, it's easier to vote out the Prime Minister. If the legislature is a problem, it's easier to vote out the legislature. It's easier to vote out the legislature. If it's both, it's still easier. If a particular MP is a terrible person, you can get rid of them with a recall proposal. I know in 2020, there was a lot, or 2021, sorry, there's a lot of people in Fredericton who are really upset that their MP defected to the Liberals at the time from Green. And I wouldn't have been surprised if recalls were a thing, that they would have recalled her. Because something like crossing the floor is a big deal, especially since I know a lot of Greens, personally, don't think the Liberals are serious or do anything on climate change, which is fact-checked true. They don't do anything, or at least whatever they do doesn't do anything, or whatever they do isn't successful. So, in that regard, that is a pretty big slap in the face to their voters. Makes sense. Now, I don't think it should always be a case that crossing the floor is a recall. That's up to the people in the riding. I think all these reforms, so we go back to just here, just to wrap this up here. So the first two would be relatively easy to do. I think a single act of legislation could make both of these work. I think open primaries would work even better if we got rid of the current Westminster system and adopted something like a US system light with fixed-term parliaments and the executive elected separately from the legislature. Because then we can always make sure that there's never any caveats. We can always have an open primary before the election. So everyone will always be able to have a choice on their representative. With that, I'll wrap this up here because I don't want to make this too much longer. If you liked the video, press that like button. Press the subscribe button too. It really helps the channel. It's surprising, and maybe not surprisingly, it is both of those actions are one of the best ways to help spread the video out. By all means, share it to anyone you could think might be interested in something like this. All the help really helps the channel, and comment below what you thought. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree? Do you think there's more actions we could take? Do you really think a proportional system is the way to go forward? All these things, by all means, love to see them and discuss them in the comments. Otherwise, I will see all of you, hopefully, Friday, June 24th at 8 Eastern Time for a live stream.